All right. So we will get started. Welcome to Artists and Their Art with Dr. Ellen Longsworth. I'm pretty sure everybody knows who Ellen is. Here comes someone else I don't know on an iPhone, so we'll see. Um, so anyway, my name is Marty Ackitts, and I'm the Adult Programming Coordinator for Peter White Public Library. And I think most of you I've seen before at Artists and Their Art. But I do these introductions for the people who might watch the video after the fact. So anyway, welcome to Peter White Public Library, and I'm so glad you're here tonight. And I'm just going to talk about a couple things that are upcoming here at the library. Next week, Tuesday, we have our Blues Day Tuesday, which is going to be Tuesday, May 27th from 6:30 to 7:30 p.m. in the community room. We have Brian Wallen and Mavis Farr who are going to be performing. And if you don't know those names, you probably do know if you're from the Marquette area, the name the Make Believe Spurs. They are part of the Make Believe Spurs, a really popular group here. And then next month, we have lots of great stuff coming up, and I'll just do a few highlights. We do have our concert on the Steps series starting. Hopefully, no snow. It's going to be warm, and it'll be June 11th that kicks off. But every Wednesday, second, third, and fourth Wednesday of the month, June through August, we are going to be having musical groups. The first performer is going to be Troy Graham. And then that's on June 11th. And then on June 18th, it's the Make Believe Spurs. On June 25th, it is Cloverland, all really popular performers here. Those concerts will be recorded and posted um, as well. That if you can't watch it that night or be here that night, you will be able to watch it after the fact. And we also have some really great movies coming up in June as well, including a really wonderful German film called The Teacher's Lounge. And then also for our dinner and a movie next month, we are going to be showing Wicked, the movie Wicked. So if you have not had a chance to see Wicked on the big screen, this is your chance. So anyway, I think that Ellen probably doesn't need any introduction here to most of you. But Ellen, obviously, as you can see from the title slide there, she's an art history professor emerita from Merrimack College. And she is coming to us, however, not from Massachusetts today. She is coming to us from Florida, where it's, I'm sure, balmy and much warmer than we are right here in Marquette. So I'm going to turn things over to Ellen, and I'm going to mute myself and just enjoy what she has to say. So, all right, Ellen, it's all yours.
Well, thank you, Marty, as always, for your kind introduction. And thank you all for being here this evening. Welcome. Caravaggio was born on September 29th, 1571, and died on July either 18th or 19th, 1610, at the age of 39. Next time, I will go into what little we know about his demise, but today we kind of start at the top. And Caravaggio as a young man and developing his what proved to be abundant skills as an artist. His father was a man of repute, what we say in Italian, a maestro di casa, a master of house, meaning a kind of steward, to the young Francesco Sforza. His father was among what we would call the gentry. He owned land, and by 1563, he had married and was living in Milan. I should say that he hailed from Caravaggio, which is a town north of Milan, from which Caravaggio picked up basically his nickname. This is the Castello Sforzesco, which was built by Francesco Sforza, and it gives you an idea of the kind of presence that Milan had as a ruling state in the Renaissance and late Renaissance as well, where we basically are moving into what we call the Baroque, but we won't deal with that specifically this evening. Caravaggio was born to his father's second wife, his first wife having died, and he was apprenticed in 1584 to a Milanese painter, from which he probably learned the basics. We don't have any paintings by Caravaggio from this era, and as I'll introduce to you some of his first paintings, they don't appear to have been extant until his Roman era. He arrived in Rome about 1592 or 1593. And a little bit about the Rome that he entered, very different from the Milan that he lived in for a bit of time. What he saw there practiced in terms of art was large-scale frescoes largely. And they were produced in abundance under Pope Sixtus V, who reigned from 1585 to 90, culminating, not having to do with frescoes, but architecture, culminating in the dome of St. Peter's Cathedral you see here. Fresco decoration continued under the Pope and subsequently, and one of the finest fresco artists of the day was Annibale Carracci. And you see one of his most famous details from a vault fresco in not the church, but the Galleria Farnese in another building in Rome. Now, I'm going to be quoting a little bit here this evening, and here's the first one. Caravaggio never painted in fresco. He always worked within a relatively narrow foreground space, as you'll see, but his pictorial scope and accomplishment grew dramatically in the decades he spent in Rome. His art is also compulsively personal, with direct or indirect references, as we'll see. All of this is very different from the assimilated high Renaissance sophistication of Annibale's great frescoes, as here. Furthermore, Caravaggio, this is now my words, not a quote. Caravaggio did not draw. That is, he did not sketch his images before he began painting them. This is highly unusual. He probably learned and prepare paintings under his master in Milan, but he just did not continue that traditional practice. What he developed was what we call alla prima, ALLAPRIMA, if you're interested. It's called basically at the first. And his compositions composed in this way meant that he would begin painting a work. Let's say he has a couple of models in front of him, because he did work from people he knew. And this is something also unusual about Caravaggio. And then made some changes. So he would ask the model to change his or her position or their positions, and then he'd paint over what he'd already started and continue the composition, meaning his paintings, and they've been x-rayed, have some of them several layers of paint as he changed his mind and finally decided upon the final composition. I thought you might enjoy this slide before we looked at any of the particular images, because Caravaggio is known for his paintings of faces, for their strong realism, and especially the depiction of faces that he knew, both male and female, and also of himself. he included himself in several of his paintings, as we'll see some examples of that coming up. He employed chiaroscuro, which means a strong contrast between light and dark, and you can see that here in these details. Not that he's the first to do this, but he emphasized the contrast between light and dark. And by the way, this has yet another term, another word attached to it, and it's called tenebrism. He also was very caught up in the depiction of naturalistic details to create dramatic and emotionally evocative so-called portraits. And I think you can perhaps see that in these many faces that he produced. And he often depicted ordinary people as models for his religious and mythological scenes, adding to the realism and immediacy of his work, as we shall see. Boy with a Basket of Fruit is one of the first works of Caravaggio's of which we know anything. And it's memorable, and you might think this is very strange, but it's the truth of the matter, because the boy carries an elaborate basket of fruit. This is not a subject that was at all popular in Rome, but popular instead in Lombardy, which is the area in which we find Milan. And this is only one of the types of subjects that Caravaggio introduces into the Roman milieu that will become very popular. But here's where this basket of fruit may have come from in terms of influence. So we'll come back to him in a moment. Here is a quite delightful, elaborate painting by Vincenzo Campi, a Milanese painter. Perhaps Caravaggio knew this work. And then there is this, I think, absolutely striking portrait by Ambrogio di Paredes. This is not only a Lombard work, but it is an image which is highly influenced by Leonardo. Now, Leonardo da Vinci spent, something like 2 decades in Milan working for the dukes there. And well, of course, that's where his Last Supper is located, as I'm sure y'all know. And so other paintings of his were certainly in places where they could be studied. And Ambrogio di Paredes certainly studied Leonardo, and it would seem that Caravaggio, if he didn't know the previous painting, certainly had to have known this, because notice the contrast between the lighted figure and the dark background. This is an example of tenebrism, which Caravaggio forwarded. So I told you we'd come back to the original. This youthful figure is one that we will see over and over again in Caravaggio's work. And often, as we'll see, with what we think are sometimes subtle, sometimes pretty obvious sexual innuendo. Another early portrait, and this is a portrait, I should say, another early work that is a portrait by Caravaggio. As you can see from the caption, he's showing himself as Bacchus. Now, art historians have had a time over this figure, because some don't believe it's Bacchus, some don't believe it's the artist, but most do. And the leaves in his hair, the ivy leaves, comport with Milton speaking of, quote unquote, ivy-crowned Bacchus. And then the face is very like Caravaggio's, and we'll see another portrait of him in a little bit. Let's go on to the next. No, wait. Before we leave this figure, I want you to note how Caravaggio has presented the figure. This must seem like a small thing, but in this work, there is no form between us and the figure. So we don't have an idea of kind of the spatial ambiance in which this boy exists. Here, Caravaggio is using a ledge on which, as you can see, are fruits and more ivy leaves. And so this gives us an impression of where the figure is relevant to us in space. And this is important for an artist, for any artist who wishes to paint images which will relate to the viewers, whom he hopes, of course, will purchase the work. Anyway, Bacchus mulatto means sickly Bacchus. This is a nickname that this painting was given long after it was completed by art historians. Now, this work is particularly significant, even though it's been lost for quite some time, because it was part of a number of paintings which were owned by a French dealer in Rome, paintings of Caravaggio's, and which was purchased, as you can see from the caption, Cardinal Francesco Maria del Monte. Now, this cardinal was not only significant as a cardinal, but he carried a lot of weight in Rome, and especially in the realm of art and artists, as he was the head of the Accademia di San Luca, so the Academy of St. Luke, which is the Academy of Art and Artists. And what occurred with Del Monte acquiring this painting by Caravaggio was he became so, I think you could say, obsessed with Caravaggio's work that many of the paintings you'll see coming up were created for Del Monte, but Del Monte invited Caravaggio into his mansion in Rome, where he lived for I don't know how many years, with a passion of bread and wine. So the cardinal took care of him in that respect as well. Because when Caravaggio traveled to Rome, he was virtually penniless. I didn't mention this to you, but his family, all of his family had died of the plague, and he was orphaned at something like 9 years old. And then he fell in with the master, the Milanese painter, and then found his way to Rome. Now, this is an interesting painting in that it is duplicitous, isn't it? You have this young boy who's innocently looking at his cards, and this older figure in the back, which often is called a gypsy, so we'll call him a gypsy, who's peering over the young man's shoulder and indicating to the other young man who's reaching in his belt at the back, and it looks like he's got a pocket back there, with a couple of aces, telling him what to pull out in order to beat the other young man at cards. Again, as with the basket of fruit, this was a subject, and here you could call it a narrative. We have a story going on here that was not known in Rome, but it becomes popular as this work was known for long enough to be copied several times over. And you'll notice here that Caravaggio gives us a larger table, right, as well as more figures. So we have a much better idea of where we are in relationship to the figures. The gypsy fortune teller is another piece of duplicity, as one of my sources has it. And no one before Caravaggio, again, as far as this subject was concerned, ever represented a gypsy fortune teller. And again, these compositions will proliferate after this one. So what is happening is this delightful youth. He's reminiscent of the youth we've seen before, isn't he? Is looking kind of wistfully at the gypsy, pretty little girl, and he's dressed well, so he's wealthy, and she is tracing the girdle of Venice on his palm, whoever that is, anyway, or telling him about his loves to come or something like that. And at the same time, she's extracting the gold ring from his little finger. Very subtle, much more subtle than the card sharps. And once again, we see Caravaggio concerned with details, not only of facial features and expression, but also of textures, particularly that boy's, what is it, silk, satin, costume, something of the sort. This consort of youths was the first painting that Caravaggio painted exclusively for Cardinal del Monte. And it has as its basic tenet love as analogous to music or vice versa. There is a winged Cupid in the upper left-hand corner, and he is he's playing with a bunch of grapes. Again, fruit as well as music here, and in this context, certainly having to do with pleasures of the flesh, not to mention the young man to the right, who was very scantily clothed. Now, we don't know anything conclusive about Del Monte, but I'll just throw out what is surmised, and that he was, if not a homosexual, a heterosexual person. And so these beautiful youths that Caravaggio painted for him clearly would have endeared him to the artist. Now, the figure in the near center with the lute seems to be tearing up. Is this music sad? What's going on here? We don't know. Let me show you a detail. So the figure there to the far left, his eyes are kind of watered. His mouth is open, as if he's having some kind of hard time. But again, it is an exquisite example of Caravaggio's interest in what he sees. His figures are not idealized. Maybe the near naked forms are, but otherwise these faces are very realistic. And as I said, he worked from friends and other people he knew, like concubines, for instance. And by the way, he may have been heterosexual. We don't know. This lovely painting, the lute player, represents what has been called an androgynous youth. A well-known modern art historian misidentified this figure as female, in fact. But he looks out at us with the same kind of dreamy expression, but no tears in his eyes, playing a lute with, as you can see, a bouquet of flowers, including roses, lilies, associated with love. And this is a work that Caravaggio declared. We have very little information from the artist himself, but he declared that this was his most beautiful painting. So you can agree or not. And this is another painting that he created for Cardinal Del Monte. This figure of Bacchus is probably one of Caravaggio's most well-known works. And it's a real puzzlement. Not that the subject isn't obvious, but what is going on here? Here's a Bacchus with flesh that looks almost, soft and female-like. And he's offering that goblet of wine. And perhaps, as one of my sources said, he may be also offering himself as he's playing with the bow, the tie that secures what little clothing he has on. One of the details of this painting, which is really quite remarkable and very Caravaggesque, is what you see in the lower left-hand corner. And that is the little pitcher, glass container of wine. And notice that the wine still has bubbles around the edge, having just been used to pour the wine into that goblet. The kinds of details that Caravaggio was known for, those realistic details. And here, by the way, we have yet, you could say, an elaboration of the setting with Bacchus reclining on some kind of divan, very comfortable. And again, we see where he is in relation to us. And by the way, I've just got a message that I need to plug my machine in or I'm going to lose you. I'll be right back. There we are. This is a related painting in terms of the face of this figure. Not that it's meant to be Bacchus by any means, but it's also related in that it's an effeminate boy. And as you can see, the middle finger of his right hand is being bitten by that little lizard that's emerging from some thorns. And there is also, let me see, roses in the painting. This is very sharply foreshortened. And what that means, if you're not familiar with foreshortening, is that we see the figure in very clear perspective. That is what is closest to us, like that very strong shoulder, is larger, as it should be, than what is behind on the other side, the other portion of the figure's body. And it's thought, again, that because of the presence of the rose, and because the lizard is biting that certain finger, that this is another painting with sexual associations. I wanted you to see this quote by Carol van Mander, what this person wrote about Caravaggio. I'm sorry, I was looking for the quote because I can't see all of it because of the pictures of some of you to the right-hand corner. So you can read it for yourselves, and I'll just talk about it for a little bit. But here is a contemporary poet, playwright, painter, art theoretician, art historian, and he speaks about, as you can see, that that Caravaggio paints from nature. And the last line, he will not make a single brushstroke without the study of life, which he copies and paints. And thinking whether this is true or not, thinking so very little of his own work. But that's a contemporary interpretation of Caravaggio, the person, the artist, and his work. And so we've seen a little bit of this already, and going forward even more. That is his work from nature, like that glass container of wine, absolutely exquisite, exquisitely seen and replicated. He began painting religious works at the same time he was creating some of the other works we just saw. And this is his first known religious painting. What we understand about this repentant Magdalene, as it began as a portrait of someone he knew, just simple portrait of a woman he was familiar with. And for reasons only Caravaggio could tell us, he transformed this simple portrait into a sorrowing Magdalene. Her sorrow, of course, is indicative of the fact that she sinned and she's repentant. She's saying she's sorry. What she is wearing is garb, which is fairly modest compared to other artist representations of the Magdalene. But again, he was representing somebody he knew. He transformed her into the Magdalene. And again, you could almost reach out and touch this figure. She seems so real, don't you think? And here's an excellent example of his tenebrism, by the way. There's no real setting. You get a sense of where she is, but the background is very dark in shades of black and dark brown, and the figure very light, with the light, in this case, coming in from the upper right-hand corner. The model, by the way, for the Madonna here is this same woman, okay? Cuddling and comforting the child, while a music playing angel, very scantily attired, is entertaining the family here in this quite beautifully painted landscape. And in this particular example, which is the first such example we've seen, you can look far into the distance and the sky is light. And this is a method by which artists tell us that we're looking into a very, very far distant landscape. But again, the inclusion of this nearly naked male figure is so indicative of Caravaggio. And there's no indication for whom this was created, but it follows in the footsteps of the other paintings, not religious, that we've just seen. This Ecstasy of St. Francis was painted, we're quite sure, for the Cardinal del Monte because his first name was Francis. And you see here a very unusual depiction of the ecstasy of this saint. Usually he is standing or maybe even sitting, but not fainting away, with hands outstretched to a seraphim in the sky, from which the stigmata is delivered to him. We barely see the stigmata in his his left palm, if at all. And we see him pointing to the stigmata in his chest, or actually the angel is. And here's another scantily clad male figure. And the face of this angel is very like many of the other faces we've seen of the young boys that populate Caravaggio's paintings. Now, by comparison, this Ecstasy of St. Francis by the Venetian painter Giovanni Bellini is within the tradition of such representations. Here he stands. We don't see the seraphim, but we see a bevy of clouds in the upper left-hand corner, and assume the light is coming down from thereabouts and reaching St. Francis as he stands, already having received the stigmata. So to go back, this is very, very unusual, very sensual, as virtually all Caravaggio's paintings are, at least to this point. Saint Catherine was a saint who was strapped to the wheel that you see there, and then it broke and she was saved. I'm not sure that she died first, but anyway, she was saved. And here's an absolutely elegant representation of a female figure. Look at the clothing: silk, satin, variously patterned, abundantly beautiful. She, on the other hand, is attractive, but she's, again, is one of Caravaggio's ordinary people. She's not an ideal. He was particularly interested, as we'll see here in the next work, by pain and, well, here, murder, and the consequences, at least for this figure, Holofernes. And so, of course, this work illustrates a very famous story about Judith saving her people by bedding down with Holofernes and then beheading him. And here's a detail, another very fine image of a face. She even looks rather concerned, doesn't she, at what she's doing. As the old lady, another incredibly detailed and expressive visage looks on. What I also wanted to say about this work, just going back to my notes here, is with this composition, Caravaggio begins to, as one of my sources tells us, darken the darks. You can see aspects of the figures, particularly Holofernes, quite dark in shadow, and the tenebrism here taking hold. And he's concerned here, as I was trying to say, with drama and cruelty, which is also echoed in this head of Medusa. Another sacrifice, but for good, as we understand the story of Medusa. With this face, could very well be the artist's face. We're not sure about that, but it's close. Look at the detail in the snakes' bodies, and the reflection of the light, which creates a silvery texture. Realistic. Not to mention Medusa's eyes. And we return to still lifes. This still life is one that I've seen many times, having studied in Milan in the Biblioteca Ambrosiana, where this painting hangs. And what is really interesting about this, aside from the fact that it's an exquisite portrait, and here I mean that word, portrait, of these various fruits and leaves, some dead and deteriorating, some quite alive and well, so to speak, that this work belonged to Cardinal Federico Borromeo. Now, the Borromeo were a very important family in Milan. And another Cardinal Borromeo, Carlo Borromeo, you might know, was the cardinal who instituted what we call the Counter-Reformation. And so, in other words, this painting belonged to a very important member of that family. And he had it hang in this library, the Biblioteca, the library, Ambrosiana, which he founded. So it's been there ever since the late 1500s. And what you see here is something that we haven't seen before in Caravaggio's work. Look at the basket and how it rests on this ledge. Now, it's not going to topple into our space, but we have a sense that it's inching its way into our space. This is called trompe-l'oeil. It's a method of suggesting illusionistically that this basket of fruit is soon to belong in our space, trompe-l'oeil. Very sophisticated method of illusionism, basically. Now, this basket of fruit finds its way into this very famous painting by Caravaggio. And I included in parentheses who commissioned the work and then who finally owned the work, because the cardinal is another very important figure. So as Caravaggio moved along in time, and it hasn't taken him very long at all, he's barely been in Rome 10 years, 8 to 10, not even, when he painted this work. He's become very well known, very well thought of. So here's that basket of fruit, not quite to fall off the table, but the impression, the illusionistic impression, is very similar. Now, I want to read you something. I'll try to shorten it a bit in case you're not familiar with the biblical story, which you could say ends in what you see here. It's Luke 24, verses 13 to 32, and I won't go quite that far. The same day, two of them, meaning disciples of Christ, were on their way to a village called Emmaus, which lay about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and they were talking together about all these happenings, the crucifixion, for instance. As they talked and discussed it with one another, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them, but something kept them from seeing who it was. He asked them, "What is it that you are debating as you walk?" They halted, their faces full of gloom. And one, called Cleopas, answered, "Are you the only person staying in Jerusalem not to know what has happened there in the last few days?" "What do you mean?" he said. "All this about Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "A prophet powerful in speech and action before God and the whole people. How our chief priests and rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death and crucified him. What is more, this is the third day since it happened. And now some women of our company have astounded us. They went early to the tomb, but failed to find his body, and returned with the story that they had seen a vision of angels who told them he was alive." By this time, they had reached the village to which they were going, and he made it as if to continue his journey, but they pressed him, saying, "Stay with us, for evening draws on, and the day is almost over." So he went in to stay with them, and when he had sat down with them at table, he took bread and said the blessing. He broke the bread and offered it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. And this is exactly the moment that Caravaggio depicts, right? And he was known, as you'll see in yet another narrative upcoming soon, that as he focused on these biblical narratives, he emphasized the moment of the given drama. The follower with arms outstretched, is this Peter maybe? He looks like it should be. The other apostle about to get up from his chair because he just can't stand what he's just undone. And of course, the servant who knows nothing and so doesn't react. Now, that gesture of Christ is none other than a variation on the gesture of this figure of Christ from Michelangelo's Last Judgment. Because Caravaggio was looking around at important works of art in Rome. And this is not the first time, or I should say this is not the only time, but I think it is the first time that he will look at a Michelangelo and find a way of using what he sees in one of his own works, a variation on what he sees. And again, tenebrism wins out here, doesn't it? The figures are lighted, but from light that comes from above, the background is dark and even darker behind Christ. And look at his face. It could be a face of anybody, not idealized. It's not like this classical figure, this classical face of Michelangelo's. Now, this next, I think, will probably be the last several paintings I'll talk about today. We have just a few minutes left. The Contarelli Chapel in this important church in Rome, San Luigi di Francese, which means the St. Louis of the French, was a chapel that had gone through a series of, you could call it phases, in terms of commissions to find the appropriate artist to decorate it. Caravaggio was not the first artist who was asked to see if he could decorate this chapel in this church in an appropriate manner dedicated to St. Matthew. This is the man who owned the chapel, as you can see from the caption. This is the church itself, beautiful kind of late Renaissance facade. And maybe some of you have seen this chapel, decorated on the three walls that you see, both sides, and then over the small altar by Caravaggio. On the left is the calling of St. Matthew. Straight ahead is the inspiration of St. Matthew, and then his martyrdom to the right. And you can see that especially the paintings on the flanking walls, left and right, are very large. And they are the largest paintings Caravaggio had executed to date. So this was a real challenge for him. And also, he did not paint in fresco. This kind of decoration typically was created out of fresco, but not Caravaggio's work here. And here's another view. If you're there, this is kind of the skewed view that you would have from one point of view of the left-hand wall. Calling of St. Matthew takes place on a street. I'm sorry, my internet. I'm told it's not good. Boy. I'm sorry, I hope I don't lose you. Anyway, takes place on a street. Sometimes it has been emphasized that in fact we're inside a tavern. We're not. We are outside on a street, and you can see the corner of the building there to the left. And there are several figures which are sitting around this table to the left. Two of them are youngsters, as we've seen in other of Caravaggio's paintings, very well dressed and carrying swords, as did Caravaggio himself, a subject for the next time. And approaching them is Christ with his arm extended, outstretched, and St. Peter. Now, we'll come back to this, but I want to show you the face of Christ. Handsome, but not idealized. And this outstretched hand is that of Adam in the creation of Adam in the Sistine Chapel ceiling. Christ as Adam, Adam as Christ. The same limp hand, extended finger. Sorry, let's go back to the full view. And you can see that the dark shadow from the right helps us see Christ and St. Peter, but also emphasizes the diagonal from Christ to St. Peter. Now, who's he pointing to? This has been a debate literally for years. Not these boys. They're curious onlookers, very like the boys we've seen already in Caravaggio's paintings. Is he pointing to this fellow who seems to be pointing to himself, doesn't he? And looking at Christ as if he's saying, "Is it I, Lord? If so, of course I'll follow you." And this is the interpretation that primarily is given to this painting, but it's wrong. Christ is pointing to this figure who's not paying any attention at all. And if you look at the bearded figure, you can see that that pointing finger of his could be pointing at himself, but also could be pointing to that younger figure at the far side of the table who is not paying any attention. And that is precisely the case, because that is St. Peter. But the puzzling quality of this work has followed the notoriety of Caravaggio through the ages. When I was an art historian, I learned that it was the man with the beard who was St. Matthew. True. The inspiration of Matthew here has an interesting history in that this is the first painting that Caravaggio created for this space, but it was rejected. Why? One of my sources says because the foot of St. Matthew would be kicking out at the priest at the altar. What I think is that St. Matthew looks like he needs too much guidance here. An old man who needs to have that angel guide his fingers over this book to find out what he is to proclaim. So that rejected, this is what Caravaggio created. A much more vigorous, right? Fluid, dynamic paintings, angels swooping down to, it looks like, count on his fingers whatever he wants Matthew to be thinking about. But Matthew is already at work at his desk, looking up, being inspired, but not being helped along like a decrepit old man. And here's a nice detail of the two. Look at that expression on Matthew's face. He's a little surprised, isn't he? Furrowed brow. I mean, just like any individual you might know, elder individual who's surprised as surprised can be. And the fluid drapery of the angel is really quite extraordinary, don't you think? And then finally, and sorry about those little tabs. I couldn't find anything without them that I wanted. Okay. The martyrdom of St. Matthew. Cacophonous. One of Caravaggio's most violent paintings. The beheading of Holofernes is calm compared to this. The screaming youth, the cowering figures on either side, the angel above who's giving Matthew that palm frond of salvation as he lies about to be stuck to death by that sword, that long sword. Now look to the back of the painting to the left, way back, after we look at Matthew. This is Caravaggio looking on, sorrowful, mournful. The artist himself witnessing this martyrdom. Okay, we'll start here next time. Thank you very much.
All right.
Anything anybody wants to see again? Any questions or comments?
I love cliffhangers, by the way, Ellen. You've left us on a cliffhanger here.
Well, it is 7:30.
I know. Does anybody have any questions or comments? If you want to, you can unmute or you can put them in the chat, whatever you would like to do.
That very last one we were looking at, can we look at it again? Yeah. Oh, no, it wasn't that one. Maybe the one before that. Yeah. So when we were looking at his shoulder, and below the elbow of the angel, Matthew's shoulder, I see a source of light, and then I was kind of confused, and I see a little bit of light on his foot and on his hip. And when I saw this yellow on the bottom of his loose garment,
Yeah.
I was looking for a source of light.
Well, I would assume, Bev, that it's coming from where we are, because there's no source of light otherwise.
Yeah, no, but on this garment on the bottom,
Yeah,
it doesn't, it just matches the light. It really isn't being illuminated, isn't it? Isn't it part of the design of the garment?
well, it probably is then, yeah.
Yeah.
I see what you're saying. Yeah.
But at first I found myself looking for a source of light, Anyway.
So that what he's wearing is lined, maybe.
Maybe so.
That lighter,
Yeah.
material.
Uh-huh.
Oh,
Ellen,
good looking.
Ellen, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I was struck by the beauty of the ecstasy of St. Francis. It was just stunning. Is there anything else you can say about that one?
Let's take us back. I know it's exquisite.
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Other than Meg, it's so out of the ordinary. And Caravaggio, as I think you've seen, was a very emotional person. He oh, this is another story, but he had his own way about most everything, which didn't necessarily correspond to what people thought a person should be doing or thinking or feeling. That's all I can say is because I've never seen anything like this either. As the ecstasy of St. Francis, as I mentioned, I think. So all I can say is what I said is it's a very personal interpretation on Caravaggio's part. And it's in a very dark landscape. where did the stigmata come from? We're not told. I don't know.
Can you zoom into the hand, the left hand? Can we see any stigmata?
Well, I can't do that.
Oh, you can't do
Um,
that. Okay,
Maybe
okay.
one of you can know. Actually, looking at this, when I decided to include it, I didn't see any stigmata,
Okay.
frankly. It just, the hand is held in such a way that it's intimated that, well, maybe
Yeah.
it is intimated that it's there.
Mhm.
All the angles.
Sorry, Meg, I really can't answer your question.
Yeah, it's just breathtaking. It really is.
Yes, it really is. You're right. You're right.
I just wonder about all the angles, the geometry of it, if that's,
No, I see what you mean.
yeah,
The
and the
way
color.
the angel is kneeling, the way Francis's arms are kind of akimbo, but the diagonals they
Yeah.
make up the composition. You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. The wings, yeah.
I love the way that bow, the end of the bow catches the light. Do you see that?
Yeah, sure do. Yep,
Mhm.
it does.
Things are illuminated when you're not expected, like the angel's toes,
Oh, yes, you're right. You're right.
and
He didn't follow the rules.
Oh, bravo. Thank you, Ellen.
thank
Well,
you,
thank you
Ellen.
very much. Thanks for being here. Appreciate it.
Okay.
All
right.
right. Well, Ellen's going to be doing part 2 of
Okay,
Caravaggio
okay.
in July,
All right.
July 15th. So stay tuned. You will get part 2 of that. I want to thank you, Ellen. I love you, and I always appreciate you
Love you
doing
too,
these.
Marty. This
So
is great fun. Well, it's fun, but I enjoy it. Hey,
yeah.
Lee, how do you do?
Absolutely. All right. Well, everybody, I hope you all have a really great evening, and thanks for coming. And hopefully we'll see you at some other events here at the library. And if not, we'll see you in July for part 2 of Caravaggio with Ellen. So you all have a great night, okay?
Okay, you too,
Nice
Marty.
hearing
Marty.
you guys.
Thank you, Al.
All
Bye,
right.
everybody.
Marty.
We'll
My
see you
pleasure.
later.
Thank
Hey,
you, Ellen.
co-captain.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, guys.